When comparing Soviet and German tanks of the Second World War, optics are often mentioned. The famous Zeiss optics are spoken of constantly, but people often confuse different things. The truth is that Soviet tanks were not inferior in terms of gun sights. Many of those sights have survived to this day, and one can see them in person. German tanks, however, had an advantage primarily thanks to their observation devices. Their visibility was superior to that of Soviet armored vehicles, and that often became one of the reasons for victory on the battlefield. At the same time, it is worth talking about the development of German tank optics during the war, because the situation around it was rather ambiguous. A favorable situation with observation devices and sights among the Germans did not arise immediately. The appearance of those sights and viewing instruments that began to appear on German tanks after 1933 was preceded by an evolution remembered by only a few specialists. Successful solutions usually emerge after numerous trials and errors, and the Germans were no exception. It should be said that their work on observation devices had begun as early as the First World War. Even the first commander's cupola in its familiar form appeared back in 1918. It was installed on the medium tank Sturmpanzerwagen Oberschlesien, which remained only a project, and also on the not-so-project LK2, the final version of which became better known as SRV M21. In fact, the turret version of the tank equipped with a machine gun had already been created during the war, but the series could not be completed in time, so later the design was used by the Swedes. Thus, Josef Vollmer's creation, which did not make it to the battlefields of the First World War, had excellent visibility for its time. It had a commander's cupola with viewing slits and observation devices in the turret, some of which could be closed with armored covers. Against this background, its peer, the Renault FT, looked like a cramped, blind tin can. Incidentally, this was exactly the impression expressed by Swedish tankers who tested the single Renault FT they had purchased. Theoretically, it had a cupola, but visibility from it was very poor. Of course, the LK2 had the same typical problems as all tanks of that period, primarily that the viewing slits were unprotected, and any fire aimed at them could wound the crew. The funniest part of this situation is that the Germans practically did not make any use of their experience from the First World War. From the point of view of sight and observation device design, the tanks that they began to develop in 1926 had nothing in common with Josef Vollmer's creations. Both Krupp and Rheinmetall, who were designing turrets for the new tanks, did everything in their own way, sometimes contrary to common sense. On the medium tank Army Wagen 20, later renamed Grosstraktor, the commander was removed from the turret entirely and placed in the hull to the right of the driver. He was given an observation cupola from which he could see something, but not much more. In the two-man turrets, there were only two optical devices, two periscopes, one of which was the sight, and a pistol port for the gunner. That was all. The Germans tactfully avoided writing about the visibility of that tank, but it was quite poor. Even more peculiar was the turret of the light tank Leichtraktor. It was developed by Rheinmetall and looked more rational from the outside. It had the same combination of a periscopic sight and an observation periscope, as well as viewing slits with glass blocks in the side hatches. However, the turret was not two-man. In fact, its crew initially consisted of 3 men: the gunner on the left, the loader on the right, and the commander at the rear. The periscopic observation device was intended specifically for him, but the first tests at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground showed the absurdity of this idea. The inside of the turret was far too cramped, so the commander was removed, and the turret became a two-man one. It turned out that the visibility of the first German pre-war tanks was quite poor. It certainly did not surpass the tanks of other countries. However, some nations still adopted the idea of a periscopic sight and observation periscope. First, it was borrowed by Soviet tank designers. This is how the tank periscopic panoramic sight and the commander's periscopic device appeared. Second, the turret of the light German tank, in a slightly modified form, was adopted for the Swedish tank. The following Swedish tanks also had a similar design, especially when it came to sights and observation instruments. At the same time, the commander's cupola appeared on a later model, which featured a somewhat different turret design. Third, through the Swedes, specifically through the Bofors company, this type of sight design reached the Poles. Therefore, the German light tank and the Polish tank were, in a sense, relatives. At least their gun mounts and sights had common roots. In July 1932, the development of a new medium tank began. The project was assigned to Rheinmetall, the creator of the most successful version of the heavy tank. However, this was an entirely different tank, with very interesting features. Judging by all indications, the Germans had closely studied the British medium tank, since several ideas were clearly borrowed from it, particularly the machine gun turrets, which, as with the British, each carried 2 machine guns. Moreover, Rheinmetall's turret was clearly designed with the British main turret in mind, whose principal innovation was the commander's cupola placed to the rear, creating a bulge in the turret's structure. Subsequent development of this tank led to the creation of the vehicle known to us as Rheinmetall, named after the developing company. The vehicle proved to be a dead end, but it implemented several solutions that later became fundamental for German medium and heavy tanks. This also applied to observation devices. The commander received a cupola located in the rear part of the turret behind the gun mount. Furthermore, the machine gun turrets partially evolved into the turret for the light tank better known as Panzer I. This turret is interesting because after it, the horseshoe-shaped form became the favorite design of German tank builders. In the case of the Panzer I turret, there were also some features related to tank optics. First, this tank was equipped with a telescopic sight with 2.5 times magnification. The Germans once again decided that they were different from everyone else. This was not just a tube, but a cleverly designed sight with a distinct bend. It had a special adapter that placed the eyepiece of the sight above the driver's head. This made aiming safer and allowed the sight to be positioned more conveniently. Second, the Panzer I turret, developed by Daimler-Benz, was the first to feature vision hatches integrated into the movable armor of the gun mantlet. This was a rather controversial decision, as there was a risk of taking a bullet or shrapnel straight to the face, but the idea was carried forward in the Panzer II and Panzer III turrets. On the Panzer IV turret, developed by Krupp, such hatches were also present, but they were moved to the front part of the turret. Finally, this turret had 4 vision hatches on the sides and rear. This solution improved overall visibility, but some of the hatch designs were debatable. To begin with, vision slits were present in only 2 of the 4 hatches, specifically the rear pair. Therefore, to see anything, the crew had to slightly open these hatches. And that was a risky invitation to a stray bullet. In addition, those hatches that had viewing slits were equipped with glass blocks made of hardened glass. A good idea, though mostly in theory. Similar observation instruments were installed in the turret base section. Further development of observation devices continued on the Panzer II tank. Here, the driver received a newly designed observation device, complemented by a binocular system for combat driving. This mechanism moved along rails mounted on the roof of the control compartment. In combat position, the observation hatch, without a viewing slit, was closed, while the combat driving device was set into working position, allowing the driver to observe the surroundings through eyepieces. This system was considered more successful than the driver's viewing devices on the Panzer IV and was used on the experimental prototype as well as on early models of the Panzer III. As for the new German medium tanks, they introduced a very successful sight design. The sight had a so-called broken structure, meaning it was equipped with a prism block that made its front section movable. Thanks to this design, the sight did not have to be installed strictly along the turret's axis. It could be positioned wherever it was most comfortable for the gunner. This system significantly improved the gunner's comfort and consequently aiming accuracy. The first combat use of German tanks followed in Spain. Among the military aid provided by Germany to Franco's forces were early modification Panzer IV tanks, operated by Spanish crews and the Condor Legion. During the fighting, it quickly became apparent that the machine gun-armed German tanks could do little against Soviet T-26. One German tank was captured and sent to the USSR, where it was thoroughly studied. The Research Center for Armored Vehicles had no complaints about the optics, including the observation devices. However, the Germans themselves held a different opinion. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Thoma, who led the group of German instructors and mechanics, prepared a rather harsh report at the end of November 1936, in which he criticized, among other things, the observation devices. It turned out that observation slits were excellent targets for small caliber bullets, and the glass blocks were easily penetrated by bullets and fragments. It is worth noting that Soviet glass blocks were more reliable, especially in terms of protection, though the German observation devices provided a better field of view. As a result, improved observation devices were introduced on the early Panzer II models. The glass blocks now had a thickness of about 2 inches, and the shape of the observation hatches was slightly modified. The design of the driver's observation hatch changed significantly. It now had a V-shaped profile and featured a viewing slit. These hatches were also introduced on the early Panzer IV and on later modifications of the Panzer III. The reliability issue of observation devices also had to be addressed in commanders' cupolas. It quickly became evident that the existing cupola design, which lacked protection for the viewing slits, was vulnerable to fire from rifles and machine guns. However, early models of the Panzer IV and Panzer III had already been put into production with the old cupola design. Starting with later models of the Panzer III and Panzer IV, a new cupola was introduced, equipped with a special visor that covered the viewing slits. This cupola design remained in use for quite some time. Additionally, later models of the Panzer IV introduced a new driver's observation device. It featured 2 movable shutters that slid up and down, providing improved protection. This device was also implemented on later Panzer III models and remained in use until the middle of 1940. It later appeared on the late model Panzer II as well. This new system was designed to withstand heavy machine gun fire. New, more massive observation hatches with thicker glass blocks were also introduced. Thus, by the beginning of the Second World War, the Germans had gone through a long path in the development of tank optics, which naturally brought them significant advantages. In terms of observation devices, they were at that time the undisputed leaders. However, certain shortcomings would begin to appear later on. The Polish campaign revealed certain shortcomings related to the observation devices of German tanks. As for the medium tanks, the situation was more or less acceptable. At least no major problems arose, though some flaws were still noted. The driver's viewing device did not provide full protection from shrapnel and bullets of calibers larger than a standard rifle. The system with movable lashes, which could be raised and lowered, had too large a surface area, creating the risk of jamming. Therefore, in the spring of 1940, a new version of the driver's observation device appeared. It became more massive, and instead of 2 lashes, it featured a kind of visor that provided better protection for the viewing slit. A new commander's cupola also appeared, in which not the entire visor, but only small segments of it could be raised and lowered. The situation with light tanks turned out to be more complicated, as they were the most numerous German first-line tanks at the time. The idea of having many observation hatches might have worked well in peacetime, but during the war, German tankers harshly criticized the light tank for poor visibility from the commander's position. Meanwhile, in September 1939, the Germans encountered the most advanced invention of the Polish tank industry, the periscopic observation device designed by Rudolf Gundlach, better known as the Mk4. Periscopic observation devices had existed before. For example, Czechoslovakian commanders' cupolas had periscopes, but of rather complex construction. Gundlach's innovation lay in the use of a prism system that was simpler and more reliable than mirrors. Moreover, if the top of the periscope was damaged, it could be removed and replaced from inside the tank, restoring full function. The Mk4 could also be rotated in different directions and had limited movement in the vertical plane. The result was an excellent observation device, variations of which are still used in armored vehicles to this day. The Germans also appreciated Gundlach's creation, though in their own way. The genius of the rotating periscope idea seemingly passed them by. Instead, they valued the construction of the periscope itself and copied it in their own style. In October 1940, work began on equipping previously produced light tanks with a commander's cupola fitted with 8 periscopes that replicated the Mk4's design. The result was a highly successful construction, probably the best commander's cupola of its time. It provided excellent all-around visibility, and the periscopes themselves were protected on top by an armored plate. Most importantly, the cupola was very low, and the commander's head did not protrude beyond the turret's outline. A very sound decision in terms of safety. By that time, Gundlach's periscopes were already being used on British tanks, while the Soviet tanks, particularly the KV, had begun to feature mirror-based devices of their own design. However, the Soviet instruments still lagged behind in both design and placement. There were many mirror devices, but they were arranged inefficiently, resulting in poor visibility. For this reason, when Soviet military specialists examined a German medium tank in 1940, they were deeply impressed. Despite the fact that the vehicle used relatively outdated glass block devices, they provided better overall visibility. Consequently, Soviet designers planned to equip the KV-3 tank with side turret observation hatches similar to those of German medium tanks, as well as a commander's cupola. However, unlike the Germans, the Soviet engineers initially intended to install periscopes rather than glass blocks inside the cupola. Usually, when designers became familiar with prismatic periscopic observation instruments, they gradually implemented them in their tanks. But that was not always the case. Sometimes, in an even stranger twist, periscopic devices were partially abandoned. That was precisely what happened with German heavy tanks. On the VK-30 Ora-1H tank, they planned to install a whole battery of periscopic devices in the turret. One periscope was for the gunner, two for the loader, and the commander was to receive a commander's cupola like on the Panzer II. A logical question arises, however. Why were the gunners and the loader's periscopes fixed? Such placement severely limited their fields of view from their positions. The situation was very similar with the VK-36.01 turret, but there the gunner was left without his periscope at all. By the way, both turrets had side observation hatches. The turret of the VK-30.01P, which later became the turret for the Tiger AOSFE, looked like a clear step backward, no periscopes at all, replaced instead by outdated slit observation devices with glass blocks. At least this is a strange decision for a tank that was meant to have reliable armored protection. It was obvious, too, that enemy infantry would inevitably fire at the observation slits. Equally strange was the approach to the driver's observation devices. If the VK-30.01H received an observation device of the Farza Klappa 50 type, in essence Farza Klappa 30 but already for an armor plate 2 inches thick, then the VK-30.01P and VK-36.01 tanks were given a less advanced design. The device was bulkier, yet for some reason they returned to a system with a lifting visor, which was more vulnerable to enemy fire. In this respect, the situation with the observation devices on the Tiger AOSFE looks odd. Its turret, which, as has already been said, resulted from the evolution of the VK-30.01P turret, displayed a remarkable combination of the progressive binocular telescopic sight, TZF-9B, and frankly outdated observation devices that lagged behind world trends. At first, there were no periscopes in the turret at all, and the gunner and the loader had only 2 observation slits in the sides. There were periscopes in the hull. They stood in the lids of the driver's and the radio operator gunner's hatches, but someone higher up clearly considered rotating periscopic devices to be un-German, so the periscopes were rigidly fixed in the hatch lids. Very little could be seen through them. The commander's cupola itself turned out to be quite tall, which made it a priority target for the enemy. For example, it was treated as such in the Soviet manual for fighting the Tiger. What German tankers themselves thought about the Tiger AOSFE commander's cupola is clearly visible from the memoirs of the tank ace Otto Carius. The commander's cupola was torn off my Tiger. Shrapnel hit my temple and face. The wounds, of course, bled heavily, but nothing more than that. Kramer always condemned me for smoking, but if I had not leaned out to light a cigarette, my head would have remained in the cupola at the critical moment. It goes without saying that I did not lose my head in the most literal sense of the word. And I was not the first this happened to. The reason must be sought in a design flaw. On the first Tigers, the commander's cupola was still welded on. It protruded high and had straight vision slits. The hatch lid stood vertically upright when it was open. Thus, it should have been understood by anyone that the tank was vulnerable from above. An explosive shell only had to hit the hatch and the whole blast would collapse onto the commander's head. If the commander wanted to close the hatch, he had to bend over the side of the vehicle and climb out up to his hips to free the safety catch that held the lid. The commander's cupola on my Tiger was completely blown away. Shrapnel wounded my temple and my face. The wounds, of course, bled heavily, but that was not the worst thing. Kramer always scolded me for smoking, but if I had not leaned out to light a cigarette, my head would have remained in the cupola at that critical moment. It probably needs no explanation that my head would have been blown off in the literal sense of the word. And I would not have been the first to have that happen. The reason lay in a design flaw. On the early Tigers, the commander's cupola was still welded on. It projected high above the hull and had straight vision slits. The hatch cover stuck straight up when it was open, so it should be obvious to everyone that the tank was vulnerable from above. It was enough for a shell with an explosive charge to hit the hatch, and the full force of the blast would bear down on the commander's head. If the commander wanted to close the hatch, he had to bend over the side of the vehicle and climb out by his hips to release the safety catch that held the cover. Another point encountered in Carius's memoirs and those of many other German tankers is considered by many to be an advantage. That was the fact that German commanders often fought with their heads out of the hatches. Thus, in Carius's view, an advantage over Soviet tanks was provided. But if you think about that fact, the saying, "one man's heroism is always another man's crime," comes to mind. It meant one simple truth. The good visibility of German tanks was still insufficient. In combat, the head sticking out of the hatch was a priority target. Carius himself, who acquired a stereoscopic telescope, acknowledged this. Exactly the same shortcomings were initially present in the new German medium tank, Panther. It had a very similar commander's cupola, with slits covered by glass blocks. The gunner and the loader had no vision slits at all, let alone periscopes. Combined with the complex binocular telescopic sight, this looked rather odd. The situation with the observation instruments in the fighting compartment was a little better. Both the driver and the radio operator gunner had periscopic observation devices. In addition, the driver had an observation hatch in the upper frontal plate of the hull. In practice, this hatch was used more during driving because it provided a better view. At the same time, none of the periscopic observation devices were made rotatable, which partially nullified measures to improve visibility. It is also clear that German designers were gradually depriving crews of flank visibility. This is especially evident in the example of the evolution, or rather the degradation, of observation devices on German medium tanks in the period from 1942 to 1944. Changes began in 1942 and were directly related to the appearance in the Red Army of a large number of anti-tank rifles. If anyone thinks that the instructions for fighting enemy tanks wrote "shoot at vision slits and hatches" just for form's sake, they are deeply mistaken. Blinding an enemy tank was an important task for infantry, and they engaged in it constantly. As a result, observation hatches on the sides of turreted German medium tanks disappeared first. They had no vision slits anyway, so they were partly pointless structures, and the side armor was weakened quite significantly. Next, the loader's observation hatch in the turret front was removed on the Panzer IV. The next victims were the observation hatches in the sides of the turret bustle. Ultimately, the remaining observation devices were the commander's cupola, the gunner's sight, his front observation hatch, removed on later models of the Panzer IV, and the driver's observation device. By the way, by the time the next Panzer IV modification appeared, the driving combat device had been removed. In this regard, the Germans were not alone. Shooting at observation hatches was a favorite pastime of infantrymen, so these disappeared from American tanks as well. Yet there was one important difference. While removing some observation devices, designers in other countries were simultaneously working on introducing others. Periscopic observation instruments that either fully copied the Soviet periscope or operated on a similar principle. In 1943, Soviet tank designers received the requirement to install such a periscope. Not without difficulty, this observation device eventually appeared on Soviet tanks, along with its analogs. The Germans, however, removed observation instruments without replacing them with new ones, even though the technical capability to install a periscope on the turret of the Panzer IV model certainly existed. This is where the paradox of German tanks lies. They began to suffer from the very same flaws that plagued Soviet machines in 1941 and 1942. Of course, some work on correcting these mistakes was carried out. The Tiger, during production, received a periscope for the loader as well as a new commander's cupola with prismatic observation devices. A similar story occurred with the Panther, and in 1944, the vulnerable driver's vision port was even removed. But these were no more than half measures. Even the new King Tiger, which appeared in 1944, suffered from the same problems with side visibility. What exactly prevented German designers from equipping tanks with rotating periscopic observation devices remains a mystery. Why they failed to provide the driver with observation instruments like those on the Ferdinand, where there were 3 periscopes, a record for the Germans, also remains unclear. It is difficult to believe that they were incapable of doing so, since the very same rotating periscopic devices were present on the tank destroyers of the Panzer IV model and the Jagd Panther. Undoubtedly, the overall production situation, which worsened from early 1944, gradually affected optical systems as well. The same German menagerie was forced to switch to monocular telescopic sights. Yet it is easy to see that the crisis with observation devices began at a time when the situation was not yet so dire. Of course, other countries faced their own problems, but the general picture is clear. While visibility in tanks of other nations improved, in Germany it steadily deteriorated.